Dr. Robert L. Okin, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's nice to be here, David.
Well, it's nice to have you here. And you are a world-class expert on human rights, mental health, and homelessness. And maybe you can give us a brief personal history then about how you wound up in this field. And let's start with, where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, which is a small suburb outside New York City.
Okay. And what was your family environment like? What kind of, obviously you didn't grow up homeless.
No, well, my parents were both very progressive politically
Okay.
and very active in various political movements. So I would say politics and social activism and
Ah,
concern about poor people were just part of the food and drink that I took in as a child. It was all
yeah,
around.
yeah. Clearly, that had a big impact on your future. On what did you want to be when you grew up as a kid? Did you have an idea? When I grow up, I want to. What was that?
Well, I remember clearly when I was about 4 years old, my teddy bear was always getting sick. And I was
Oh,
always rubbing its nose with a Kleenex and trying to bring it back to health. And
yeah.
then it lost the plastic eye, and I tried to sew it back on. So I I wanted to be a doctor ever since I was 4 years old.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. And did you have a doctor in the family already or not? No. So you were really uh, breaking new ground for your family in terms of achievement.
Yeah.
Yeah, they must have been very proud of you. And where did you go to school to get your degrees?
Well, I went to a public high school and got involved in writing an alternative school newspaper
Oh,
because because the principal of the school wouldn't allow me to uh, publish a letter to the editor of in the regular school newspaper about the segregation that was occurring in the school system in New Rochelle.
yeah, yeah. So you
So I,
were a little bit of a rabble rouser,
yeah,
even
yeah.
then, going way back. Yeah. And then how about college and medical school?
Yeah. I went to the University of Chicago and graduated in 3 years, and then went to medical school there, and then uh, uh, did my internship and residency at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx.
Yeah, wow. Those are solid credentials. Well, the second edition of your book, Silent Voices, is coming out later this month. And tell us about that book. It's the second edition. So tell us about the structure of the book, because it's a little different, I think.
Yeah. Well, the first section of the book is largely about my experiences on the street. So I guess this jumps a little ahead. I decided to spend 2 years on the street after I left my position as chief of psychiatry at San Francisco General Hospital. Um, and I,
Now, were you retiring at that point? Was that why you left?
well, I wasn't really retiring, but
Uh-huh.
in that position, I saw a lot of very poor, very disabled, mentally ill people.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wondered what their lives were actually like, which you couldn't you couldn't really tell it from the environment of the hospital.
Yeah.
So I decided when I left the hospital that I wanted to spend a couple of years on the street talking to people who were homeless and mentally ill.
That sounds courageous. You kind of rolled up your sleeves and decided to get your hands dirty, so to speak,
Yeah.
in the real mess of the world. Yeah. So take us through that, through that
Well,
experience.
yeah. Well, I think the thing that really precipitated my interest was a kind of almost trivial experience I had uh, shortly after I left my position. I was I was in San Francisco and I was walking to my car and it was rainy and cold, and I was kind of hurrying to get into to the safety of my car, and I saw this little woman huddled up against the cold and the rain on the sidewalk.
Mhm.
And I just, it really touched me in a powerful way. I felt like I had almost deserted her by getting into my car.
Yeah.
I was going to stay dry and she was going to be wet and cold night after night after night. And
Yeah.
I just couldn't understand how she could bear it, just unrelenting suffering. So I decided that I would spend time on the streets talking to people who were mentally ill and homeless. And I expected that I was going to just be totally blown off by people who I approached, but they didn't do that. They they seemed to welcome the opportunity to talk to me, and they were kind of surprised, I think, that I was interested in them and their stories.
Well, I think so many of us, we see these people on the streets, unfortunately, more and more now, and which we weren't used to seeing for years, and they're growing numbers, and it's a tough thing, I think, for the average person to come to grips with and to figure out how to deal with it, and we would rather just ignore them or not see them, pretend like we don't see them. Well, it's very hard. I find it hard to pretend like I don't see them. I mean, I also have a therapeutic a background like yourself, and so it's hard to turn off that caring. But on the other hand, there are perhaps legitimate fears of they won't want to talk to us. They'll feel intruded upon. Maybe they're crazy. Maybe they'll attack us. Um,
Well,
so
I have to say, you know, just to dispel any idea that I was brave in doing this, I have to tell you, when I first started to approach people, I would spend 2 hours tracking someone around the
uh,
streets. We're trying to work up the courage to,
okay, I can
and
understand that. Yeah,
And it wasn't really that I was afraid of them. What I was afraid of was that they would blow me off and think I was weird and just, would tell me to get out of their faces.
yeah,
Uh, but as I said, they didn't. And I think the other thing that really bothered me was that I had this worry that I was almost voyeuristically spying into the misery of lives that had been treated so poorly. And, so I felt somewhat guilty about that,
yeah. I can understand that.
and worried that they would somehow discern that and, not want to talk to me.
Yeah. Now you actually At some point, did you record these conversations?
Yeah. So after I started talking to people, I decided that I really wanted to share their stories with a larger audience. And I began asking them if I could record our conversations. And and then I was so struck by the beauty of their faces and the way that life and suffering had engraved
Mm,
themselves on their faces, that I felt I couldn't do this without actually photographing them as we talked. So it was in the beginning awkward to have this camera between me and the people I was talking to, and I worried that it would just be too much of an interference. But both of us very quickly kind of forgot the interference, even though I was photographing them as they talked. I didn't want to stage the photograph.
yeah.
I wanted to photograph them as they told me about their stories. And, as you could see in the book, a lot of people, a lot of people had tears in their eyes at some point during my conversation with them. I had expected to find people with hardened shells and, a kind of toughness. And I found the opposite. I found people uh, whose suffering was very close to the surface. And they were willing to talk to me about the most personal and often shameful aspect of their lives. It was, they have the bravery.
Did you get some sort of release from them where, there might have been that concern that you needed to have legally a concern for
Yeah,
having a release?
yeah. I got a verbal release. I thought that trying to get a written release would just, enshroud the whole thing in
Sure.
legalities and formalities and so on. But about 70% of the people that I approached were willing to talk to me, knowing that it would become part of a public document.
Yeah. Did you did you know it was going to become a book? Did you tell them that it was going to be in a book?
Well, gradually, I decided that I wanted to turn this into a book, because that would be the way I could share their stories with a public audience. So at the point that I began uh, photographing and recording them, I knew that I wanted to turn this into a book, and so I asked them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was surprising that they were willing to participate in this. And I think there were many reasons for that. One was that most of these people had been just ignored as children and grew up feeling kind of invisible.
Mm,
So the idea that somebody really wanted to hear them and see them, I think, encouraged them to talk to me and participate in this. But I think another reason was that, they really wanted to leave a mark on the world,
yeah.
and they they wanted to do good, and they wanted to know that when they died, that their footprints would still be in the sand.
Hmm. Hmm. So now you're bringing out a second edition. When was it that you did this experiment or experience?
2014 was when 2010 is when I got when I started doing it on the streets, and the first edition was published in 2014. But the first edition was primarily it had three parts to it. One part was my experiences on the street, meeting with these people and what I learned from them. Because I was also very interested in how they managed and what the subjective experience of homelessness was like, not just the physicality of the experience, but what the emotional impact of it was. I wanted to know what their joys were, what their sorrows were, what their regrets were, how they spent their, so much empty time on the street. So
Yeah.
all of that was in the first section of the book. The second section, which was the primary part of the book, were photographs and first-person narratives that I had recorded of people that I met, about 40 or 45 people. So the second section of the book consists of photographs and first-person stories. The third part of the book was very small. It was about causes and solutions to homelessness. And I think I was kind of worn out by the time I finished the first edition.
Yeah.
So after a couple of years passed, and last fall, I decided to expand that third section and really delve into the causes and solutions for homelessness.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second edition, we got.
Yes. So that was the motivation for the second edition. And who's your target audience as you think about the people who are going to spend money to buy this book on a
Well,
topic that many people want to avoid?
yeah. Well, I'm never crazy about preaching to the choir. So for me, the best audience would be people who avert their eyes when they pass these people.
Mhm.
And it's that group of people that I want to help see homeless, mentally ill people in a different way. Because let's face it, we not only avoid them, we're scared of them, we
Right.
stigmatize them, and we blame them for their homelessness and their poverty and their mental illness. I mean, the truth is, the reason that this problem has not been solved is that we basically despise this group of people. And that may seem like an exaggeration, but it's not.
No, I don't think it is either. I mean, we have historical records in novels and such, and from other cultures. I think one of the shocking things is that this was for a long time was considered to be a problem in places like India, Bangladesh,
Right.
etc. Other places, other people's problems, and we could feel a bit superior that, oh, thank goodness it's over there and it's not here. But somehow the situation has evolved for, I sort of fear that we're in a depression, really, not just a recession, but I think we're in an economic depression that's maybe global. You can hear I have a certain amount of hopelessness around all this. So it's been something even in Sonoma County. I live not far away from you. It turns out you're in Napa County and I'm in Sonoma County, and I've hung out in San Francisco a lot in the earlier days. And so to see the growth of this over time has just been shocking, that, okay, now I see in downtown Santa Rosa, there are tents along the road, and lean-tos and all, and you wonder, well, how does the city allow this? But on the other hand, where are these people supposed to go? What are they going to do? So take us through some of these thorny issues, and I gather you haven't really totally given up yourself.
No. I have a strong conviction that when enough people decide that government needs to solve this problem, that they will push government into doing it, and not before. So it's the reason that I wrote the book, because I want to spread the word about these people,
Yeah,
and try to humanize them for the public, so that
right.
they won't keep averting their eyes and blaming them and so on and so forth. It's very easy, David, to see the problem as primarily one of individual failure. And there's no question that individual factors play a huge role in creating the problem. Most of these people were abused and neglected and damaged in other ways as children. And, as they got a little older, not too much older, they turned to drugs to try to soften the pain of these early experiences. And they then fell behind in school and entered adulthood with almost no employable skills, and without the capacity and the abilities to function in the normal world. So there's no question that there are individual factors. I wouldn't call them failures. I would just say factors. And after all, a lot of these people who became mentally ill were predisposed even before they were born, that they had some genetic predisposition to serious mental illness. So, most of these people just never had a fighting chance at a life. So, and when they finally reached adulthood, all it took was the smallest little reverse in their lives, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, some disappointment, something to push them into the streets. And
Yeah,
that's what happened. But what's, I think, even more important are the systemic or structural factors
sure.
that compound these individual factors that lead to what we see on the streets. And, some of the factors that are just never talked about are the values of American society. And let's face it, we live in a society that believes that people should be able to keep most of what they earn. And this view is deeply embedded in our consciousness as a nation. And we've developed an almost godlike idealization of independence, self-reliance, and productivity. But the downside of this is that we're intolerant of those who lack these capacities, and we're highly ambivalent about helping them. In fact, the people who need help most, we despise the most, and we're least likely to help. And I would say this idealization of individualism has too often led to a lack of community spirit. And this, I would say, is expressed in our taxation policies, which are largely responsible for the huge disparities in wealth in this country, which touches on the the points you were making a few minutes ago about the fact that, scratch the surface and part of our society looks like a third world country. We never really, in discussions of homelessness, I think we never really talk about these underlying values and the fact that the top 1% of United States household owns more than 15 times more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. And this concentration of wealth has led to the existence of a group of people at the bottom who have almost nothing. And homeless people are perhaps the most extreme and visual casualties of this vastly unequal distribution of wealth. Although the causal connection between the two is conveniently ignored. While we've come to accept and justify this situation as almost the natural order of things, the fact is that there's nothing natural about it. It's the result of unfettered market forces, and it's supported, as I said before, supported by both our taxation policies and unfettered market forces. The taxation policies allow a small group of people to retain pretty much most of what they earn, and the estate tax provisions allows them to perpetuate their extreme wealth into the next generation, guaranteeing that their descendants maintain this advantage through no efforts or talents of their own often. The fantasy that people in this society have equal opportunity can be seen as just that. It's a fantasy. And the fact is that relatively few people begin in front of the starting line, and a large number of people begin behind it. If we truly believed in equal opportunity, we would create ways to level the playing field, when in fact we do the opposite, and we've stacked the deck of opportunity against those at the bottom right from the get-go. And the shadow side of this, and the way we've perpetuated it, is that people who've been born into poverty through no fault of their own, who begin life behind the starting line, have little chance of acquiring wealth during their lifetimes, and really have nothing but poverty to pass on to their descendants. So equal opportunity is just a fantasy. And homeless mentally ill people are arguably trapped on the lowest rung of this steep economic ladder that has its feet virtually underground. When we pass them by, we conveniently ignore the inequalities that they faced and instead blame them for their poverty and their symptoms, allowing us to justify our refusal to help them. And since housing in this society is considered a privilege, not a right, the people who have no housing have little chance of ever getting it.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Just looking at the rising cost of living, I think many people are getting edged out that never thought they would get edged out. The cost of housing, in California going up and up and up is shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. And because the cost of housing, in contrast to people's income, has gone so far up, homelessness has risen and risen and risen, and it keeps rising. In the last several years, it's gotten worse, not better.
Right.
And government is doing very little to change this situation. very, very little, despite the hand-wringing of politicians. You know, when you look at how the money is spent, when you follow the dollar, you can see what we really care about in this society and who we don't care about. So we abandon these people, but we keep wringing our hands about it. Ain't it terrible? Ain't it terrible? Yeah,
Yeah.
well, we really believed it was terrible. We would make our governments create economic policies that solve this problem, because, David, this is a totally solvable problem. I mean, the idea that it's just impossible is absurd. I mean, you look at other Western democracies, for example, there's not anywhere near as much homelessness as there is in this society, both because their tax policies are different and because housing is considered a human right, not a privilege.
Mm. So I gather what you're advocating for the average citizen is to become more politically active and to put pressure on government bodies and to expand their own thinking, to embrace
Where it starts.
the ideas that you're talking about, to move away from any sense of blame of the victims.
Yeah,
Yeah, and to come from a place of compassion,
yeah,
but also righteous anger
yeah,
to change the situation.
yeah. You know, some people have said to me, well, look, why don't these people just get a job, for God's sakes? You know,
Right.
why should we have to help them? They should just pick themselves up, you know, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and get themselves off the street. But the fact is, they don't have boots and they don't have straps. So how are they going to do that?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
anyone, you know, when someone says to me, well, why don't they just get a job? I say to them, okay, think about it. You know, if you were in rags, dragging a cart around,
Yeah.
you know, smelly, dirty, unwashed, and with no phone and no address to even tell a prospective employer where to contact you. I mean, how are you going to get a job? It's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah.
Absurd. It's an absurd and convenient fantasy that allows us to feel okay about the fact that we hate these people and don't want to help them.
That's a strongly persuasive bottom line there, Bob. Um, it's probably a good wrap up. Is there anything more that you want to say to wrap up this conversation?
Well, there's one thing that I just want to mention, which I experienced when I was talking to these people. You know, I know it sounds, I'm sorry. I know it sounds irrational, but I often felt so close to the people that I talked to.
Yeah.
And I felt like had the deck of cards been distributed differently, I could have been
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
who was pushing a cart around the street, and they could be the one that was interviewing me.
Yeah. I think I've had a deep fear of that, actually. You know,
Yeah.
a sort of people have tried to persuade me an irrational fear of poverty, but it's not. You're only just a few steps away, if that much.
And it's luck. It's luck
Right.
So who of us got the genes that led to, you know, a healthy life and a childhood with parents, who loved us and who listened to us and supported
Right.
us on the one side, and on the other,
Well,
the
as
other.
you know, we haven't discussed there's a huge political divide right now, right, in the country. And I think, on the extreme can be characterized by the kind of person that you're saying, oh, they should just find a job. Um,
But even,
uh,
yeah, that's very true. Even looking at the amount of affordable housing in society, I mean, there's just not enough, not anywhere near enough affordable housing, so that people who are the most fragile and the most vulnerable are always going to be the ones that are left behind, that don't have it. It's a little like musical chairs, when but there's not enough chairs. And when the music stops, the question is, who's going to
yeah,
be without a chair? Well, if you don't
yeah,
have enough chairs, somebody is going to be standing.
yeah.
And, unfortunately, in this society, it's a lot of people are standing.
We have adult kids, and fortunately, our adult kids seem to be doing okay. But I know that because they've had the benefits that we were able to, to pass on in terms of education and good home life and all of that. But there are so many kids in this county and the county where you live that will not be able to afford to live where they grew up. It was always assumed that if you grew up somewhere,
Yeah.
you could just hang out there and you'd get a job, and your lineage would just be able to continue. But that seems to be radically shifting.
Yeah. Social mobility, which really was responsible for a lot of this society's health, I would say, has really diminished over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, Bob, I really want to thank you for your compassion and your passion and compassion, and the fine example that you're setting for all of us, and your inspiring will to action. So thank you for sharing your message with us.